Hello everybody and welcome back to another CB Showtunes tutorial. Now today what we're going to be getting into is building this grenade launcher. Now currently we don't really have any form of particle effects going on, that I'm going to add later, but what we have is the ability to fire and of course cause radial force to our enemies. So there's a lot that goes into this tutorial, and I know sitting through it can be quite difficult sometimes, so I went ahead and wrote down the scripts. That way it's easier to follow along and you could just knock it out without having any problems. So before we get into that part, we are going to modify the weapon controller script because I did find a problem with our fire rate, and I'll get right on into that. Okay, so here is the modified script. Just make sure that you check your script out if you've been following alongside this tutorial or tutorial series, and you'll be able to catch up really fast. So at the top, we set up this public boolean called isProjectileWeapon. This will help us determine whether or not we're going to be using a breakcast or if we're going to be using a projectile as our bullet. The next thing you're going to notice is, of course, I added this header for base settings. This is going to be the initial setup. So you have your public transform called the spawner, the range, the fire rate, just like we did with our original weapon controller tutorial. I also added this public boolean called animation loops. This allows us to be able to determine if we're going to be like a semi-automatic weapon or an automatic weapon. So so I'll just write in semi to automatic, just in case you need that there. So next we have a header called projectiles only, and it's exactly that. So we have a public game object called projectile. This is our prefab we're going to be spawning. We have a public float called auto destroy time. This means that if we do not make contact within like 5 seconds or so, then it's going to destroy itself automatically. And of course, lastly, we have these two variables. One's a boolean called inCycle, and this is basically determining whether or not we are. Actually, I think we didn't need that. Yeah, that's depreciated. We don't need that. So we actually only have this one float called cur rate. Now, cur rate is going to determine if we are still within our fire rate. So this is how much time we have before we can shoot again. And this is the constantly changing variable in between. Okay, let's go down here. So inside the void update function, you're going to notice a lot of things are different. So we have, of course, this cycle check boolean, which we're going to get into that in a minute. But this cycle check boolean allows us to be able to detect if we are currently reloading or not, or not reloading, but checking our fire rate. So then we're going to ask another check. We're going to say if our cycle rate or our cycle check is active, then we're going to set our current rate minus equals time.delta time multiplied by 60. So this allows us to have, for every 1 frame, is now equivalent to 1 integer. Okay, so underneath the fire 1, I basically just checked, of course, our cycle again. So if you notice this little exclamation point before the cycle check, this is basically saying if our cycle check is equal to false. So if I had a boolean value, say for instance, this is let's just say bool value. So if I have a boolean value like this, and I want it to equal false, then this not value allows this bool value to equal false. So it's just a little trick that you can add inside there instead of having to write like a double equal sign or a not equal sign. Alright, so here we have the ability to set our animation. So I asked a question, if our animation loops. If it does, we're going to set our Boolean value like we did last time on our animation. So if you recall, if I head over here into Unity, it's going to probably make some noise, so just give it a minute. Okay, so if we head back over here into Unity, we're going to hit our animator. And if you remember, we had a Boolean value up here called fire. Well, or firing, is firing. We basically changed this value from is firing to just fire because why not, right? And we have this set as a Boolean value because this weapon right here is a automatic weapon, at least for our Hell Whaler. And now for our grenade gun, so I'm going to select our grenade, you can notice something a little bit different. So let me go over here. You can notice that this is a trigger instead, and it's set as just fire as well. And of course, it runs the same fashion as the other one, except it has exit time here instead of a condition. So the reason why we did that is because if our animation loops, we want it to automatically loop, and we don't want it to return back to the default state. But if it is, or if it doesn't have an animation loop, then we want it to just fire once and then go back to the default state. So we just set the trigger here instead. And of course, obviously, we're going to shoot. Keep in mind, this is input.getButton. We're not doing the get button down because that activates only once. We want this to constantly check. And of course, we have the fire afterwards. Lastly, inside this function, we're going to add in our button up. And instead of checking the cycle rate or cycle check like we did inside the previous equation, we're going to be checking the animation loops because we want to make sure that whenever we release this button, if the animation loops, we want it to stop firing. So we're just setting our weapon shake Boolean as false here. I know, super complicated, guys. I mean, alright, so for our projectile script, it's super simple. It's just like instantiating anything. All you need to do is ask if we are using a projectile weapon. Now, this is the same variable that we had up here, is a projectile weapon. And if it is, we're going to create or spawn an object. So GameObject.spawn. Let me go and zoom in real fast for you guys. And we're just going to be spawning this as a variable called spawn. And we're instantiating that projectile prefab. We're then setting its position and rotation. Then we're going to be grabbing its rigid body component, adding force to it, and we're just going to be shooting it forward by the range that we had set up right here. And of course, the force mode, you can use whatever you want to use. I'm going to be using impulse because I personally find that best for like this sort of weapon. Lastly, we want to destroy this spawned object based on our auto destroy time. Now, all this is going to happen if our weapon is a projectile. What I want you to do now is also surround this raycast hit with an else statement. That way, this will only activate if this doesn't activate. And at the very end, outside of all these ifs or else statements, we're going to set our current rate equal to our fire rate. So we're just going to be resetting our value. So lastly is our Boolean called cycle check. This is a very simple Boolean value. We're going to say if our current rate is greater than 0. So hence, if we shoot, our current rate is now greater than 0. We're going to return as true. Otherwise, we're returning as false. So now we have the ability to decide if we are reloading, or not reloading, but if we have a hitch inside of our shooting. All right. So that's all you guys need to do there. Make sure you save that. And we're going to head back into Unity. All right, so the next thing we need to talk about is obviously the animation side of things. Whenever you create your animation, keep in mind, is it a semi-automatic weapon or is it a automatic weapon? Because if you set it up as a automatic weapon, say for instance, if I go over to our scene view real fast, and I'm going to select my weapon, right? So let's go over here. Actually, we could just go over to scene view and watch it. So if I actually activate this Hell Whaler and just deactivate this for now. Yeah, let's do this. So if I press play on this animation right here, you're going to notice that it's going to be set up for automatically firing. While if I go over to my grenade weapon, so let's go ahead and do that, you're going to notice, oh, I grabbed the wrong one. There we go. You're going to notice that it has a ending form because it's supposed to stop. Okay? So to make sure that you do have these animations stop, let's go over to your animation folder, which, like I said, if you've been following along as of the previous tutorials, you will have these folders. And of course, if you want to make your weapon, it's exactly the same way that we did the first weapon. So just go back and recreate your own weapon and then just add in these variables in the way that you want it to be. But anyway, back to the animation side of things. So if you notice on my automatic weapon, I have it set to loop time, while my grenade weapon, I have the animation set to loop time as false. The reason why I do this is because this is a semi-automatic shot, and this is an automatic shot. Same thing with the animator. I believe I showed you this earlier, but over here we have fire set as a Boolean on our Hell Whaler, which is a automatic, and is set as a trigger on our grenade launcher. So cool. The last thing we really need to cover inside this tutorial is, of course, our grenade script. Now, I know this is going to put this over the top. It has so much going into it, but let's go and hop right into that. So to create a grenade script, go over to your assets folder. You're going to find your scripts folder, go over to your weapons folder, right-click, create, and create a C# script. Now, this grenade script, it's a pretty common script. It's super easy to do. And I'm actually going to change this variable real fast. Yeah, that should work. Okay, so for this to work properly, we're going to create a couple variables. We need a public layer mask called hit physics layer. This is going to be the layer that's going to be interacted with the explosive force. We want to create 3 public floats. One is directional velocity, one is upward velocity, and one is radius. So obviously these 2 are for the force. This right here is going to be the distance around the object that you want the, I guess you could say, collision to interact with. Now, inside of the void on collision enter, this is basically whenever your object hits another object. I want to do a couple things. So I want to first get a vector 3 called hit pose, which is equal to our current position. So basically, wherever the object hits the ground, I want that to be the point where everything happens. Next, we're going to grab our collider, and we're going to set this up as an array. And we're going to call this hit objects. Now, this is going to be equivalent to our physics, and we're going to overlap a sphere. So imagine us creating a sphere around our object. So to get this sphere, we're going to get our current position, so our hit pose. We want the radius of this sphere, which is our public float. And we want to set a layer mask to where it only interacts with a specific layer. We're then going to run a for each loop on our collider. So we're going to call that collider hit in this group. So any object that joins this collider group, or it gets hit by this collider, it's going to be added into this loop check. Then we're going to basically find the rigid bodies on each one of these objects. So we're going to say rigid body RB is equal to hit.getComponent rigid body. Now, if our rigid body is not equal to null, then we're going to add the explosive force. So to get that explosive force, just make sure to add your directional velocity, your hit position, your radius, your upward velocity, and then what type of force you want to use. And of course, lastly, you want to destroy this game object. Now, I think there's a better way to do this because I don't want to actually add another physics layer. So I'm going to actually come up here. I'm going to say if collision.gameObject.name is equal, or actually, we'll say tag is equal to player, then I want to return. That way we don't run any of this otherwise. So there we go. Control X. All right, and at the very end, just make sure to destroy the game object within a certain amount of time. If you want, don't hard code that and actually put that in there as a float value or a variable value, because hard coding is terrible. Just in case you want to change things later, just keep that in mind. At the way bottom, I set this up just for being able to visualize what I have going on. So if you want to just copy that, you can. It's pretty self-explanatory. But yeah, it simply just gives you a description of what you're doing. So let's head back over into Unity. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to set up that prefab. So we're going to go over to Assets, go over to Prefab. I already created this as well. Just keep that in mind. But all we're really doing here is, if I go over to my scene view, to create this base projectile, simply create a 3D object inside your hierarchy and just call it like a sphere. Add a rigid body onto it. Set it to continuous dynamic. And then just remove the mesh renderer. Rename it as base projectile. And then drag it into your prefabs folder. Now to add in the extra effects, like say for instance the grenade effect, what I want you to do is select your base projectile and press Control W. So Control D. That will allow you to duplicate that object. And then from there, just rename it as grenade. Go inside your grenade and drop the grenade script onto there. Change the hit physics layer to everything. And I'm actually just change it to everything. Of course, you could set your distances to whatever you want it to. And as I said, these will give you like a pretty general idea on how far things are going to be affected. So yeah, you can do whatever you want with this. So yeah. And cool. Alright, so we now have our grenade ready to go. So head back over into your scene view, select your grenade weapon, drag that grenade projectile into your projectile. You could set all these things up as you want. So it's projectile weapon, range. You will need to drop the range from what it was, which is 500 currently, to a very lower number, I guess you could say, because that's how much force we're going to be using. Set your fire rate up. Keep in mind, if your animation is 60 frames, according to this right here, set it up to the exact number. Okay, so we now have that set up. And let's see. Oh, yes. Make sure that on your FPS controller that your tag is set to player. I'm actually going to reset that anyway. No, just this object. Okay. So yeah, make sure your tag is set to player. Hit Control S. We're going to hit play. And here we go. And as you can see, we now can hold our weapon down. I can release it. And we're capable of firing off a grenade launcher. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out some of my other videos, and of course, I do plan on leaving the code for these inside the description as well, so just keep an eye out for that as well. Alright, I'll see you guys next time.